people who died, about their families, and specific details about how they killed themselves. These details can actually increase the risk of imitation by others in some ways that we'll discuss later. But this is interesting because exam failure and school-related stress seems to be one of the common issues linked to suicide in Bangladesh, and that's something that you're likely to encounter in your work in some form, whether you're a mental health professional or a media professional. So we're excited to have you all here today to talk more about how journalists and media professionals can take great care in how those stories are shared. They are important, but that can be done in a way that can actually prevent other people from considering suicide as a way to end their troubles, potentially as a result of that reporting. And this can be challenging because you may need to avoid certain details that you normally think of as very important for storytelling. So to give an outline of what we'll be talking about today, we'll discuss why suicide is an important problem. We'll talk about who is affected by suicide and where. We'll talk about the role of the media in addressing this problem. And we'll answer what is the best way to report about suicide. An activity suggestion that we have for you is to create a checklist. When you registered for this training, we asked you to be ready with pen and paper. You can do this on a computer as well if you wish. So here you will learn some principles for how to effectively report about suicide, and we would like you to create a checklist of the key principles that we discuss. You can add items to your list anytime you see something that you think you should review in your own reporting practices. Anything interesting, new, or important. At a minimum, try to look for the items that have this symbol next to them as a hint that those are some more important reporting standards. When you see that, you'll know that's an important piece. And then you can use that as a personal resource to help reviewing your own reports before you submit them to be published. Any questions now? We'll pause briefly before we move forward. Again, feel free to add things into chat as you wish if you have any questions that come up. And moving right along.
Lauren, Samiha had a question.
Yes.
Hi, Lauren. So
yes.
the function of this checklist is to basically, after you finish a few slides, like what the main points were, or like, is that what you're saying?
Yes, so this is something that we think will be helpful for the journalists and media professionals here specifically. We will mark with this symbol anything that's an important guideline to remember.
Okay.
And so basically collecting the most important key points throughout the training to be able to use those as reference material moving forward. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Excellent. Welcome. Excellent. So we will start. The first section is just discussing why suicide is an important problem. And we'd like to start with definitions so that we all have a shared understanding of what we're talking about here. And so suicide, when we talk about this, we are referring to death caused by self-injury with the intent to die. A suicide attempt is what we think of as harming oneself with the intention to die, but without actually dying as a result of that action. You'll notice a key part of this definition has to do with the desire and intention to die, whether or not that person actually ends up dying or if they survive that attempt. But that's really the key part of this that we're thinking about here. To start, we'd like to do a brief activity to see what ideas all of you have about the topic of suicide right now. So we will go ahead, go to menti.com, the website that Ariel shared earlier, and you can click on, as that appears on your screen, go ahead, take a minute to fill that out. And thank you, Ariel. Go in and type the code provided in the chat box. And then please just answer the question what comes to mind when you think about the word suicide? What are the first things that you think of? We'll give you a couple minutes to do that, and then we'll see what people are able to come up with. Just take one more minute to share your responses as you can, and then when we have a good number, Ariel will share with us what has come up. We'll talk about that briefly. Thank you everyone who is able to contribute to this. So some words that we've got up here on the screen, for those of you who might not be able to see it, the device that you're on are hospital, did not have help, death, sadness, and attention, why he or she did this, could not manage stress, sad things happened, self-inflicted, had depression, burdensome, hopelessness, and pain. So that's, again, we're interested to see what your thoughts are. We know that many of you may have had personal experience or have personal experience with someone that you know who may have attempted or may have died by suicide. And all of these we will be talking about in more depth in terms of people's different emotional factors, different situations that can impact people. And well, I believe there's some way that this collaborates in the way that people are able to contribute hopelessness. It appears differently on the screen, perhaps because of the device that you're joining from. So anyway, thank you everyone for sharing. I see a couple more we have an intentionally attempt as well. So good idea. So holding those in mind, let's go ahead and move forward. We want to share a little bit more about the problem of suicide in general and also in Bangladesh. So over 8 lakh people die to suicide every year around the world. To give you a picture of that, the scale of it, that's approximately the population of the Sylhet greater metro area this year in 2020. So that's as if you lost everyone who lives in that region around the world. People affected by suicide include those who attempt and survive, their friends, neighbors, family, and other people who are struggling with depression or other mental health issues who are also impacted by this. For every person who attempts or dies by suicide, of course, many parents, children, cousins, friends, colleagues, neighbors will be affected. So the impact of that is really something beyond what we can measure. In thinking about who is affected by suicide, it's seen in different people at different stages of life. It affects men and women throughout the entire lifespan. According to WHO data from 2012, it was seen in all regions of the world from different cultural, religious backgrounds. It was the second leading cause of death among 15 to 29-year-olds in the world in 2012. And about 3/4 of all suicides in the world happened in low and middle income countries, where most of the world's population also lives. So we can conclude from this that suicide is a significant problem for all kinds of people everywhere in the world. The estimated suicide rate in the Southeast Asia region is the highest among all the regions in the world. However, there's really very little that we know, very little information exists about the issue of suicide in Bangladesh. There's no system of suicide surveillance or data management, and there's never been a nationwide survey conducted. So researchers have tried to learn about the issue by interviews with a certain group of people at somewhere in the country at one point in time. Also by reading other articles, by studying newspaper and police reports is actually one of the ways that we have the data, what data we do. From police reports alone, it's been estimated that about 10,000 people die by suicide every year in Bangladesh, which is about 30 people dying every day. Poisoning appears to be the most common method used by men and women who die by suicide, usually by pesticides. Hanging is also common. Issues like family conflict were often reported to lead to suicide, but it's difficult to establish a clear connection from the information available. This is something we'll talk about more as well, and why it's very important to understand what connections exist and how many different reasons can impact someone's risk for suicide. Adolescent girls seem to be at highest risk of suicide in Bangladesh. This is unusual. Globally, more men die by suicide than women, and risk is especially high for young married women and for girls who are about 10 to 14 years old. I think this is often linked to situations of early marriage to older men. And the suicide rate in Bangladesh also seems to be much higher. One study showed about 17 times higher in rural areas than urban areas in large cities. And it seems that chronic poverty, especially related to lower education and literacy levels, can increase risk. And we'll talk more as well in a little bit about risk and what are some things that can impact that and what really that means. So a few things that we want to mention here. Stigma is a major problem, meaning that people affected by suicide can suffer mistrust or stereotypes or avoidance from other people. Here in Bangladesh, this could be especially related to religious factors, linked to the belief that the person is going to hell or that their soul will not be free, or moral beliefs such as feeling like someone lacked courage, which can contribute, can make people feel ashamed or disgraced to even talk about it, and can make it much more difficult for them to reach out for help if that's something that they need. This can also impact the experience of stigma or shame that that person's family will experience, and also within their community. In Bangladesh, attempting or assisting suicide is illegal, so it's punishable technically by fine or imprisonment. We understand that that's fairly uncommon, that would actually happen, but what's important here is that that shows that suicide is currently addressed as primarily a legal issue rather than a health issue. And this is treated differently in different countries. where there are more laws created to recognize and support mental health needs. People who attempt suicide are considered primarily in need of social support or mental health care rather than punishment for infraction of a legal code. India is an example of a country that has recently changed policy on this with their Mental Health Care Act of 2017. And they changed their reporting standards for stories related to mental illness, which for them have included suicide. We'll discuss some of those standards in more detail later. And to conclude this section, we would invite you all to start by being aware of what your own feelings and beliefs are about suicide, especially for those of you who are in the media profession. As you're reporting, start to consider how families, friends, survivors of suicide attempts are impacted by what you share and how you share it. Don't share information that shames them or harms them. And start thinking about how the tone of your writing can encourage people who are thinking about suicide to seek help and not to avoid talking about it because of shame or stigma. Do we have any questions? I know that was a lot of information that we went through very quickly. We're hoping to get to a lot today, but does anyone have questions about what we've talked about so far up until now? And again, we welcome you as you're thinking of things. Feel free to add questions into the chat box at any point. We will have these slides come up at the end of every section and we can address anything that you wish to talk about more. I think we'll leave the chat box open for questions and go ahead and move forward. This next section, we'd like to discuss what is the role of media. And for the next activity, we're going to go back, for those of you who can access it, to menti.com. We will have another activity. And the question that we have for you that we would like you to answer is, how do you think media can influence suicide? I'll give you a couple minutes to write down your thoughts on that. As we are waiting for people to complete this activity, so we had a question in the chat on whether we have any specific data about Europe and what is the reason for suicides there. That's something that So some of the reasons that can contribute to suicide globally are things that we'll talk about more. These tend to be common. Mental health issues are a common reason. I don't know much. I have not done much research about Europe specifically. There are some trends that hold true generally across the entire world. So in the whole world, it's usually more common for men to die by suicide than women, and older men, middle-aged to older men specifically. And it could depend on the region though. So again, in Bangladesh, that tends to be reversed. We see younger women who are actually more likely to die by suicide. I don't know because I haven't done the research about Europe specifically and what might be some of the driving forces there. Methods that people use might also be different just based on what people have access to in that culture. So that's a good question. If you have specific interest in Europe, we can certainly find some more resources to send your way. Let us know if that's the case. Send us a message to remind us and we could help you find more resources. All right, we'll go ahead and share some of the responses on what people have thought about how the media can influence suicide. So we had someone share a significant aspect of the media's suicide portrayal is that it typically oversimplifies the reasons, attributing the act to single variables such as financial disasters, fractured marriages, or exam failure, or mental disorders, the most common factor. That's a really great point. We're going to talk about all of that in more detail, but thank you for bringing that up. That's really important. We know that it is very easy for the media to report based on as though there were one single event that were responsible. We also see someone mentioned if media could report suicide properly and without rumors, wrong information, stigmatizing people, health actors could be informed about the current situation and take necessary action to prevent and mitigate suicide. Really great point. There is another really good example of how media can impact potentially many different sectors, from people working in health, others in the community. We see by negative and positive reporting approach, depicting the methods of suicide and sharing personal problems. All of those can influence suicide potentially, and we'll talk about how. Really good idea there as well. We also see media has great impact on influencing communities' views by either empowering the incidence of suicide or putting a shame spin on the incident, on the event of suicide. And both of these could lead to stressful situations for individuals. Both very true, both very important to keep in mind. We'll continue to discuss how and why that's the case. And finally, someone mentioned media has the power to influence our subconscious mind to a huge extent through subliminal or direct messages. So we need to be careful about how we present the news or data about suicide to avoid inducing such thoughts or ideation. Also a great point. We will talk a lot about language and word choice because it's true. And a lot of the ways that the media has the power to shape discourse, to shape the conversations that are happening inside homes and in communities and in groups of friends is very powerful. And a lot of the power of that happens in ways that maybe their readers aren't even fully aware of. Really good thoughts. Thank you everyone so much for sharing. I'm excited to move forward. We will get into all of this in much more detail here. So in thinking about suicide reporting, we think of it in terms of both risk and opportunity. On the risk side, research from more than 100 international studies has suggested that reporting about suicide deaths has somehow been associated with increased suicides or attempts after such reporting. That typically increases when the reporting focuses on a person like a celebrity who has died. If the reporting is prominent and repeated, if the death is glamorized or glorified, given lots of attention, really highlighted, and if the method and location of the death is detailed. We also see this as a great opportunity to help develop the course of conversation in your country in a positive direction and to share good information that's really important that can help people. The way that suicide is reported appears to be really significant. There's some studies that have shown that certain kinds of reporting might help to reduce suicidal behavior. For example, when people are able to present suicide as a really tragic loss that could have been avoided of someone's life, if it focuses on the really devastating impact that suicide has on other people, or if it gives examples or really explores a person's experience of overcoming suicidal thinking, if they had wanted or made a plan to kill themselves, or even if they attempted and survived, their experience of overcoming that can be a great example for others in terms of giving them more of a picture, a vision of what life can be like and what are some reasons that they would choose to live, having been in that position before. Now we have another activity, yes? Just one moment here.
We do have another activity. Give me just 1 second to queue it up.
Okay, great. I can. On this one, we'll be discussing any thoughts or ideas you have about how the media can influence suicide prevention. Give us one moment here. We really missed the opportunity of being able to be with you all in person. I was able to share previously with some of you, and very much miss that. This is much easier when we're all in a room together and are able to talk directly, do introductions, and have all of that. So we've tried to find ways to continue this conversation or have people participate as much as possible.
My name is Manuli Sambapti. I am a journalist, video. So suicide case in their moment, how can possible suicide attempt intentionally? Why suicide? And then publicly this reporting in your inner suicide positive or negative. And I think so. Suicide is a big problem in your mind, and then day by day, and encourage your mind. Then suicide.
Thank you, Vai, for sharing that. We will move forward. So share some of those thoughts again, if you will. So on this next link, so on the code that Ariel is about to share, go back to that website, menti.com, and type in the code provided in the chat box. We're going to, so just as you shared with us, we want to be thinking
Yes.
about how you think the media can influence suicide. So how can you in your role as a media professional potentially impact someone's decision to die by suicide, to take their own life or not? What ideas do you have? Go ahead and type those in so we can see everyone's responses all together, and then we'll talk about that briefly before we move forward. Thank you again, Vai, for sharing.
Thank you.
All right, thank you all for participating there. Thoughts we have on how you think media can influence suicide. People have mentioned informing, awareness, negative news, negatively trigger, informative reporting, alert, so giving people things to think about, ignoring mental health, positive prevention, suicide portrayal, so how suicide is presented, in the stories, and how that can impact people. Anti-rumor, so making sure that myths or common misconceptions about suicide are addressed there. Really good ideas. So keeping all of this in mind, we want to share a little bit about how this has been done, how people try to address the issue of suicide, and then what role specifically you all, especially our colleagues who work in media, can do this. So as the everyday storytellers to your society, what do you think your role is? There are different kinds of strategies that have been used to prevent suicide. This can be a little complicated to understand if you haven't seen this before, but we can think of it sort of using this pyramid. At the top of it, there's a smaller number of people, the smallest number here, who have actually attempted suicide before. And at that level, there might be mental health professionals or doctors, or especially family and community, who are working directly with those people and caring for them and helping them to heal, to recover. Other places in society are better designed to work with people who are at risk of suicide. So that's a bigger group than people who've actually attempted, but not everyone. So that could be people who've experienced depression, highly stressful situations, or trauma, different things that might lead them to think of ending their lives. And there are some ways that an entire population, the biggest group at the bottom of that pyramid, can be addressed with general education and support, and that can help reduce suicide risk for everyone. There are only 3 of those, we call them universal or population level strategies. There are only 3 of them that are supported by evidence from World Health Organization, typically has done most of the research on this, that are recommended for preventing suicide. These are restricting access to means, so some things that people would use to kill themselves, reducing the harmful use of alcohol, and the third strategy there is actually assisting and encouraging the media to follow responsible reporting practices. So that means that you doing your job really well is one of only 3 things that can be done to help reduce suicide risk across the entire population. That serves everyone in your country, and there are very few people who are actually in a position to be able to do that. And really want to highlight the unique opportunity that you have in that and how much power that role really holds. We honor and respect that really deeply. We want to talk a bit about helpful ways to present information in your reports. Again, you'll see those little check marks on the slide indicates that's something that you might want to take notes on. This can be something helpful to revisit in your own reporting practices. So first, we want to think about reporting suicide as a general issue. Covering suicide can include talking about policy, prevention, research, statistics. There are lots of areas of public interest that can be talked about there. Covering suicide sensitively and accurately can also help to challenge some myths or wrong ideas that people have. It can help increase awareness and encourage discussion and prevention activities. It's also helpful to inform the community about risk factors and warning signs, including the importance of taking suicidal thoughts seriously. This is something we'll talk about in another slide about risk factors and what those are. And finally, reporting that focuses on suicide as a health and community issue can help to increase awareness and decrease stigma. Again, we've talked about how thinking about suicide primarily as a legal issue, if the police are the only ones who are dealing with this, And if crime reporters are the only ones reporting on it, that tends to give the story a very different slant and one that might not be as helpful. So now we'll discuss what some of those risk factors are and why, because of that, it's so important to think about suicide as a health issue, we would argue. So risk factors are what we call certain characteristics of a person, a society, or a situation that are often present when someone attempts suicide. This means it's statistically more likely that people experiencing these things will be at higher risk. So mental health professionals just call these risk factors. These are some common ones. This is not a complete list. And remember that not everyone facing these will attempt suicide. It's impossible to predict this with certainty, but we know that having these specific problems can increase danger for people. So some of these, we'll just list them out, include previous suicide attempts, having a mental disorder, using alcohol or drugs, hopelessness, isolation, having low social support, not much of a network around you to support you and help you when you're having a difficult time, aggressive behavior, impulsivity, having a history of trauma or abuse where you've come very close to dying, or if you've experienced a lot of abuse from others, having a serious current emotional distress for any reason, having a major physical illness or pain, a family history of suicide, if it's been close to you in some way before, that can increase people's risk. And neurobiology, there's some things related to brain chemistry and the way that interacts with the rest of our bodies that can make certain people more prone to severe depression and other things like that. In society, at that level, risk factors include the stigma of seeking help, difficulties in accessing care, especially medical or mental health care or for substance use, certain beliefs. In some cultures where suicide is seen as honorable, that can be a challenge. Exposure to suicidal behavior, including by the media, and the influence of others who have died by suicide. If someone's died by suicide and they were very well thought of, or they were held up as a role model, or got a lot of attention, that can increase risk. And finally, there's some things to do with the situation. These would be loss of employment, loss of money can be one, having easy access to lethal methods or methods that are likely to actually kill someone, having local clusters of suicide incidents. We'll talk about that in a couple slides as well, and also just experiencing stressful life events. So take a moment, reflect, which of these can you, in your role, specifically as media and journalists or as mental health professionals, which of those are within your power to influence? We highlighted a couple here that we thought were especially important. Take a minute to reflect on that. And do remember that there are many factors that contribute to someone's risk of suicide. And we've seen, and many of you have mentioned as well, media reports often speculate about reasons for someone's suicide, but don't often acknowledge how many of these might have been present in any situation, or how complex those reasons can be. They work together, they interact, and it's important not to oversimplify this when you report on a story. The next piece that we'll talk about are what we call protective factors. This is another mental health term, very similar to risk factors, except on the other side. These are things that, when they're present, tend to keep people safer if they're thinking about suicide. And these are some important ones. They include things like having strong connections to your family and to your community, having people around you that you know care, having beliefs that discourage suicide for whatever reason that might be, having restricted access to means. If you're not able to access the thing that you had chosen to use to kill yourself with, seeking help, reaching out, having access to high quality physical or mental health care, and different kinds of social skills, things like problem solving, conflict resolution, managing disagreements well. And again, invite you to consider which of these you might be able to influence. And would encourage you to think broadly about this. How can you, in your reporting, increase someone's sense of community? How can you give people ideas about ways to seek help, about ways to connect with their family, their friends, being able to remember who it is they have around them and who would be impacted if their life were lost? Another important idea that we want to mention here that's especially relevant for media is the idea of suicide as contagious. So we'd mentioned before, one of those risk factors in situations had to do with clusters of suicides. This just means that many suicide attempts or deaths can occur within a short time or at a certain place. Often that's within a certain area or an institution like a university. And social media can affect that in ways that are very difficult to control. But it's still important for everyone in media responsible for sharing information to do that in a way that's helping people to find support and to avoid the kinds of narratives that could lead people to imitate others' attempts. So in this way, we want you to be thinking about the idea of suicide risk being contagious and inviting everyone in the community to ask, what can we all do to reduce transmission so as few people as possible are exposed to this risk? To unpack this a little bit further, we want to think about some of the precautions that might be needed when you're reporting about a suicide. People need to know what's happening. This is your job. This is why you do what you do. But if they get too close to this problem in particular, in the wrong way, this can put them at risk. There are different ways of getting too close to that issue. Examples are sensational media exposure, where it's on the headlines, where it's very strongly highlighted in reporting or when it's reported over and over and over again. Another way of getting too close would be thinking about specific ways to die or places to die. When articles highlight very specific places or when they give lots of details about the method used, that can give people ideas of what they would do, and that can help them, that can make them think about suicide in ways that can be very dangerous for them. Another one is losing known persons, such as family or friends. These kinds of details can lead people to a dangerous kind of thinking by putting them at risk of death, really, by imitating the suicides that they've heard about. And I want to share this quote with you, again from World Health Organization, who's done much of the work on this. They shared that the role of media in suicide prevention is often underestimated. The media have a distinct responsibility in how they report instances of suicide. The fact is, responsible reporting can and does save lives. Hopefully that's something that you realized before, but certainly from here and moving forward, we hope that that's something that you remember that is within your power to do. I noticed we have a question here in chat. Which attempts we can take to solve the suicide problem? That is a great question. We will get into this. So the next section is how to report on suicides. And on that, I think it's important to remember what role you have, what your job is, and what you can do within the scope of your job. And so for you, if you're a journalist or media professional, that means reporting as well and responsibly as you can. And we'll give you some very specific resources to include in your reporting that can actually help people find help and connect to resources that might save their life. things that most of this has to do with things to avoid, so details not to share or to minimize. And the other thing too, we'll talk about this at the end as well, is sharing this information with as many people as you can within your professional networks, making sure that people know some of these general ideas, just not sharing as much specific detail, and being able to present some different kinds of stories about suicide and survivors and hope, and being able to find help. That might be a bit vague. I hope that's helpful. I also hope that the rest of this workshop will be able to give you some more ideas as well. Thank you for your question. That's a great one. Any other questions at this point? Okay. The next section, as I mentioned, is how to report on suicides. At this point, we'll do another brief activity. So we'll go back to our favorite website, menti.com, and go ahead and type in the code that Ariel has provided in the chat box. And the question that we're thinking about here that we'd like you to share your response to is, what factors can you consider when you're reporting a suicide? So what are the things that you need to be thinking about when you're deciding how to share this story? Take a couple minutes, go to the website if you can, type in any answers, and we will see what people are thinking before we move forward. Yeah, thank you, Ariel, for answering that question. We had another question in the chat as people are finishing there about reporting on suicide and whether it's mandatory to mention how they attempted, because of the readers then having opportunity to perhaps have ideas about how they might attempt. It could be a way to influence them to try the same. So the question is, what type of information to avoid making during a report? That is a great question. We will go into very specific detail about what information to avoid. I don't know, and feel free to discuss in chat as well for some of you who are established in the media field about what is considered mandatory reporting practices. And we'll show you some examples of ways that looks in other countries. in some places, I know here in USA, there are some guidelines about what is considered best practice. And so it's actually very uncommon now that the method will be shared in an article. And there's usually a link saying that we're not sharing this information because we're following these guidelines from World Health Organization about safely reporting on suicide. And again, we'll get into some of those details later, but that is a great question. We thought that was important to talk about too. So we will get there soon. All right. A couple responses that we have. Thank you all for sharing. What are some things to consider when reporting a suicide? Someone says ensuring that it is informative reporting, consideration on minimal reporting on methodology and personal information, also ensuring that it does not normalize the incident, and it is important to ensure help information is available. That's great. Wonderful. That's basically the rest of our presentation. We'll share some more things, but thank you for that. Those are great ideas. Someone else says avoiding stigma, rumor, targeting a specific group of people, or adversity. Try to use clear terminology when writing a report to avoid misunderstanding. Ensure confidentiality and privacy. Report on time. Provide necessary information only. Also, all good thoughts. Answering who, where, how, what caused the suicide. Those are all good questions to ask. Depending on how you answer them, that could make a very big difference in the impact that your report could have. Also good question. We have someone else who mentioned keep the information about the location general, not sharing the content of the suicide note, and keeping information about the person general. Also great. Also basically that's the rest of the workshop. Well, we will be excited to hear more of your thoughts as we continue because we at least have been thinking similarly. So thank you all for sharing. Those are fantastic. And now we will move forward with how to report on suicides. So the first question that we want to consider and we encourage you to ask is whether to report it or not. The first thing we would recommend is ensuring that the death has been confirmed as a suicide by official sources so that the report does not fuel speculation or interfere with any ongoing investigations. Also, where possible, please obtain informed consent from appropriate relatives or close friends before identifying the person who has died in a public report. That will give the family at least an opportunity to know about the story and to think about how it might affect them. And I would encourage you to take their situation as it is incredibly heavy and delicate into account before making that information public. A third item that we would recommend considering is assessing whether the story is clearly in the public interest. It can be useful to consult with experts for advice about the impact of reporting a specific case. Is there a way that this case can share helpful information that might lead others to seek help? Or is it likely to be a situation where other people would be likely to try to copy that method for some reason, or would it cause a lot of harm in that community? Are good questions to ask. Also consider how many stories about suicide have been published recently. Research has shown that a succession, so multiple stories about suicide in a row, can reinforce suicidal behavior sometimes for people who are vulnerable. So now we'll think about what information should you share. Exposure to certain details can be helpful. I know this gets at some of the questions that some of you have been bringing up. So this is our best attempt to summarize for you what is likely to be most helpful and some of the best content that you can actually positively focus on in your reporting. So one of these is addressing stigma. You can do this by starting conversations and creating space for people to talk about the issue. Talk about suicide generally, reporting on incidents in the country or general trends or statistics. Educate people with true facts and findings from formal research if you can, and include opinions of health experts. Here's an example of a way to do this in an article. You can see there's a box, the gray box in that article, that's just giving some very basic general information about suicide and risk. Is a way that you can highlight that, remembering that most suicides don't have only one reason, don't imply that the death was spontaneous or had only one cause. Research suggests that most people who die by suicide have underlying risk factors, things they've been experiencing for a long time, which could include mental health issues, other social influences. And interviews of suicide prevention experts can improve a story by providing some more information, important details. In terms of addressing stigma, I also want to draw attention to something that Omar Bai has mentioned in chat that I think is really important. He shared that he has practical experience with more than 2 persons who had suicidal ideation and they were planning to die by suicide. But he found that a really helpful thing was talking with them openly to get their thoughts out and addressing those situations. Thank you so much for bringing that up. I think that's really important, and that's something important for us to consider in reporting as well. Being able to do writing in a way that brings about those open conversations that helps people learn how to do that and makes people feel like it's an issue they can talk about, might be able to save someone's life, like Omar Bai experienced as he shared with the people he knows. Another item that we can positively focus on for reporting is reporting stories of people coping with life difficulty or overcoming suicidal thoughts. So these are just some examples of how people who are struggling can get help and can choose to live. So again, instead of presenting an example of someone maybe who is very well thought of and chose to die, we can present someone who's in a similar real struggle, real situation, thinking the same thoughts, and chose to live, that can promote hope and encourage other people to seek help. You can also discuss how suicide affects grieving family and friends. That can help to bring awareness to the really serious consequences of suicide for people all around the person who has died. And so stories like that about suicide loss can help promote, again, awareness or discussion about the impact. We do want to mention, take care about your interviewing methods and about the published details of this really painful experience. People who have lost someone to suicide could be vulnerable or at risk of suicide themselves, and they might not have like really full capacity to consent to an interview at that moment, or to consider fully the impact that talking with you will have on them. So respect people's grief, respect their privacy, consider delaying interviews with people who are in situations such as this. We also encourage you to provide resources for help. This could be for people who are thinking about suicide, for survivors, for families who've lost or have nearly lost loved ones, or for professionals of all kinds who might interact with this issue in any form. That can help prevent stories from suicide from negatively impacting other people at risk. You need to add help-seeking information for immediate crisis support. This is very important. Ideally, this is more challenging in Bangladesh because there's only one national suicide prevention hotline and it's not 24 hours. Where possible, we like to provide at least 2 crisis numbers to call, 24-hour if possible. that should be added to any story about a suicide or a suicide attempt. If the story is online, be sure to link it directly to online support options, where they can click the link and go to the web page where they can receive support immediately. If you can, try to match the helpline or the service to the story if possible. For example, there might be a resource for adolescent girls, if it's a story about an adolescent girl. You might or might not be able to do that, but if you can, it might be helpful. Also try to inform the service if you're including their details in a published report, so that they might be able to prepare to respond to more contacts that they might have. We'd like to share one specific resource. This is the first National Suicide Prevention Hotline in Bangladesh. This was established in 2012. You can find information and updates available on their Facebook page and with other resources available on the Bangla language version. And if you want to write this down or screenshot, the next slide has all of their contact information. Again, you will notice that this is not a 24-hour helpline. They're entirely staffed by volunteers and don't have capacity for it. But please make note of this information. We will provide, we'll show you an example of how you can share a resource like this in an article. They have some really interesting insights as well about how COVID has impacted suicides that we'll touch on later. But here's an example of the text that you could use at the beginning, probably, of the article. This is from their founder and director, featured in a recent Daily Star article about the helpline. Basically just gives a brief description of what it is, what they do, numbers to call, when to call. Very simple. That's a great way to include that information. Another example of how to incorporate hotline information into your article. Here is just a clip out of a suicide prevention reporting article. You'll notice that there are a couple of linked resources here: the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, the Crisis Text Line, and others. There's specific organizations that are named here. It communicates hope. You'll see toward the bottom it says, for those experiencing suicidality, you're not alone and there is always hope, even if it doesn't feel like it now. And it also gives specific steps for reaching out, things like numbers and web links. We've highlighted some of these to you. Gives you ways to help be part of the movement, the breaking of silence. The way they're framing that story helps to move that conversation in a direction that's likely to be helpful. A note that we want to touch on is to be very cautious when reporting about suicides of well-known people. Celebrity suicides are newsworthy and will almost always be reported. We know that. But that can also glamorize and normalize suicide. And research, again, has shown that vulnerable people might attempt suicide in that same way. So things we would mention here, again, is ensure the death is not reported as a suicide until officially confirmed. That can help reduce speculation, which can be harmful and difficult to manage. Make sure it does not glamorize or provide specific details about method or location of death. It's better in this case to focus on the wastefulness of the death, its impact on family and friends, general risk factors like we talked about before, and options for seeking help. And be mindful that that can come up in other contexts or around a significant date or anniversary. and that you do need to be careful every time the death is reported or referred to, even if it's not an article fully about that suicide. Anytime it's mentioned, you're likely to come up against these same issues, and that's just something to be aware of every time. Also, again, be aware of the impact and difficulty of the issue when you're interviewing survivors or families and friends. Always take care about this, especially since attempting suicide is against the law in Bangladesh, and always respect their confidentiality unless they are in danger of ending their own life and they tell you so. Only share that information in order to get them help to save their life. We also want to mention about word choice and how important it is to be careful with the words that are used in reports. When we talk about person first language, we mean referring to people as people rather than victims or suicides or cases or deaths, numbers, masses, or any other words that distract from the human element of that issue. This is difficult. English has different nuance than Bangla, than any other languages you might speak or might use in your work. We hope that this makes sense. If it doesn't, let us know, and we can try to explain a bit more, and we'll touch on this later as well and give you some examples. So here, just as a brief overview, words that we would like to, oh, did I miss an activity? Okay. Moving forward.
Nope, you're good, Lauren. I just had it was a typo. You're good.
Oh, you're great.
Yep.
Thanks. This is an example of some of the words that we want you to be thinking about and some of the terms that are more or less useful. Again, I don't know how this might translate in Bangla for those of you who report in English. Hopefully you're able to understand how this would connect. In English, we try to talk about completed suicides rather than successful, which implies that dying by suicide is good, they achieved it. It's better to report on people killing themselves or dying by suicide or ending their life by suicide rather than committing suicide. Commit is legal language that can, again, just reinforce the stigma a little bit. We prefer then to focus on those accurate descriptive words that really highlight the human cost of suicide in terms of loss of life. And that's something that, again, the nuance is going to be different in different languages. I've done this badly 1,000 times before. And so it's okay if you've done this before. We just want you to be thinking about really what is the weight of your words? What are you communicating? And how can that change people's thinking about suicide without maybe you or they realizing that that's happening? All right, our next activity, which we can go to now. We'll go back to menti.com for those of you who have access, and answer, what information do you think should be avoided when reporting a suicide based on what we've discussed until now? All right, so a couple of responses from people had mentioned that things to be avoided based on your understanding right now might be the name of the person who died by suicide, their identity, a photo, describing intimate details about the person who died, oversimplifying or speculating on the reason. Great. The person's information, their method of suicide, news of celebrity, place. Great. Great. All of this, again, we'll go over one more time to make sure that everyone has understood well. But I think people are, again, have gotten the idea of what it is that we want to be considering and what needs to be avoided. The identity and the name is difficult because if you are reporting news, you're sharing things that are in the public interest. We would probably qualify that to say avoiding sharing, again, those more intimate details of family situations or without consent of their family, understanding that that might impact them quite profoundly. So moving forward. To go one more time over those details that are not as good to share, those details that will be dangerous if exposed too much, would be, so things we would recommend you do here are minimizing overall media attention on suicides that people have completed. So research suggests, again, that people who are vulnerable to suicide might be drawn to those stories and that the prominence of those stories might increase risk. What do we mean by prominence? We mean headlines and we mean repeating stories. So when they're published day after day after day, or if they're at the top of a page or the top of, if they're a main headline feature, that increases prominence, it highlights it, it draws attention. And again, all of those things are things that we would want to avoid as much as possible. So minimizing their prominence can be done by placing a story on the inside pages of a newspaper or further down the order of broadcast reports. Try to limit promotion of public memorials, including online pages if possible, as those could reinforce suicide as a desired outcome for people who are at risk. It's also preferable to avoid using the word suicide in a headline and in key search terms. Those can attract vulnerable people to the story. And again, try not to repeat stories on suicides or publish them on multiple outlets. Also, next piece is disclosing specific content from a suicide note can impact vulnerable people, including those whose loved ones have died. So the suicide note information specifically, if that's shared by itself, that without context might not share the whole story, or it could share a slant of the story that could cause a family a great amount of harm or shame or stigma. So that's something to be thoughtful about. Also, reporting explicit detail about the method has been linked to increases in the use of that method and overall suicide rates. If it's important to mention the method, discuss it in general terms only. We want to mention as well that reporting uncommon or new methods of suicide can also lead to imitation. If someone has died by suicide by using a new kind of drug or has ingested it in a different way than usual, that can again draw more attention, can lead more people to copy that. So do not share specific details about such methods or report ways that people can find out about them. Also, describing locations of suicide can lead vulnerable people to consider those sites and can increase the frequency of attempts at those sites. Again, if it's important to refer to the location, discuss it in general terms only. If you use images, please use general images of the person rather than images of the funeral, the grieving family, or memorials. Those can kind of glorify the death. Always ask for permission from the family before using images. Again, images, footage that show the method or location of a suicide can lead to imitation by vulnerable people as well. Avoid detailed or dramatic photographs or footage such as images of people standing on ledges or of items like a rope. Those guidelines should also be applied to the online environment. That can be more difficult to manage. I know I've seen a lot of material dealing with suicide that have very graphic illustrations or very dramatic pictures that are attached to those. Avoid those. Finally, we don't want to represent suicide as an effective escape from life or from problems. Do not make suicide seem normal. Do not sensationalize it or make it into a bigger deal. Do not narrate suicide as a constructive solution to problems. Again, all of that has to do with the crafting of the story and the slant and the kind of conversation that you are promoting across the entire country. And very, very generally, if you have a hard time remembering this, just to summarize, don't provide anything that a person could turn into an instruction book to follow. Any concrete specific details that someone could copy to do the same thing is likely to increase risk. So think about the minimum necessary personal details you must share to communicate a story. And also, again, we really want to encourage you to be reflecting on what story it is that you really want to share. So now we will look at some practices and patterns that were found in published media reports about suicide in Bangladesh recently, and would like to invite our colleague, Dr. Yasser Arafat, to share more about the role of media in communicating about suicide and the status of the issue in Bangladesh. We're delighted to have him here. It's a great honor and privilege to get to work with him. He's a mentor and advisor for the suicide prevention subgroup, and we're excited to hear him. So if you would like to introduce yourself and to share about some of your work and your findings, we would love to hear from you.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
So it's thanks Lauren, thanks Ariel for arranging the training, and it's my pleasure to attend it. What I did and what I started on media reporting status on suicide in Bangladesh, and what I see, what I got in the existing media reports. Okay. So is there any really relationship between the media reporting and the suicides? So it has been noted since the 16th century, there was a novel, Sorrows of Young Werther, and that is written by Goethe. And in the novel, after publishing the novel, the Goethe, there have been increased number of suicides following the same procedure as died by the Werther. So in 1974, US researcher David Phillips first noted the symptom that explaining any suicidal attempt or sensationalizing the suicides in the media certainly increased the number of suicides further time in the community. After that, there is an important effect on Papageno. So that is the 18th century opera, The Magic Flute. And here the Papageno asked his friends and colleagues that to solve his problem in other ways, or he will die by suicide. So ultimately, when his colleagues gave him the other ways to solve his problem, then the suicide was prevented. So from these two phenomena, the researchers find out the two effects that media reports affect suicidality of general people. That is on the Werther effect, by which the insensible media reports increase the suicidality in the general people, and the Papageno effect, the researchers find out that the sensible media reports reduce the suicidal behavior in the general people. So media can affect the suicidality of the general people in both ways, both in positive direction as well as in the increase the suicidality in the general people. So that's why media reporting could be shaped as reduced number of insensible reporting, as well as the educative material should be provided in the suicide reports. So what is seen in Bangladesh? So next please. Yes. So we have conducted series of studies exploring the media reports of Bangladesh. So the first study was done in the online news portal. Here we assess the 8 online Bangla news portals, and we did it for a larger number of period, that is nearly 8 or 9 years. But the issue is as the reports are in past, the number of reports have been reduced. So the most important media new online news portal is reporting is that is the Jago News. So the news portal has been reporting the suicide news very frequently, and importantly to be noticed that regarding the educative materials, that is none of the reports mention the expert opinion regarding suicide and the research finding, any suicide related statistics that can prevent the suicide, any prevention program existing in Bangladesh, and any educative or preventive information that can be used to prevent the attempt, and any contact identity of suicide prevention activities. And surprisingly, the reports also mention in a very high proportion that they mention the named, almost 96% reports mention the name of the deceased and the occupation of the deceased. So the method of the name of the method is also mentioned in more than 95% reports. Also, the life event was mentioned about 70% of the reports. And interestingly, more than 60% of the reports, the suicide has been described as due to monocausal effect, that is due to single cause, that is failure on exam leads to suicide, that is quarrel with husband or wife leads to suicide. So this is the baseline. This is the first study exploring the media reporting of suicidal behavior in Bangladesh. So let's see the further studies. So this study is conducted in the 6 printed national newspapers: Prothom Alo, Daily Ittefaq, Daily Jugantor, Kaler Kontho, Independent, and the Daily Star. So how do you see? The Daily Star has been publishing the reports in lower frequency, and Jugantor has been publishing the reports in higher frequency. In the among the online news portals, we see that Jago News has been publishing the news very frequently. And if we see the reporting characteristics, then we may see the similar phenomenon as reported in the previous study. At least 7% of the reports have been found in the front page. That is highly important area of the newspaper. And if we see the educative material, again is absolutely nil. That is, there is no expert opinion, no research finding, no population-based data, and no suicide prevention program. And if we see the harmful characteristic, that is the identifying information of the person died by suicide, that is also in high, very high. The suicide method was reported in almost 99% of the reports, and detail of the method was mentioned in more than 75 of the reports. So here again the monocausal explanation was more than it's about 45%. So we see the both the online news portals as well as the mostly highly circulated 6 printed national newspapers have the same scenario, that they are mentioning high proportion of uh, potentially harmful characteristics of the suicides, as well as they have nothing to mention with the educative materials. Next, please. So that is the replication of our previous study. We did the follow-up study, and in the previous study we did in a retrospective manner. But however, in this paper we did in a prospective study, and we follow the same news portals, and we see the same situation as none of the reports mention the any of the educative materials. And very important reasons of suicide, that is psychiatric illness and mental illness and the drug abuse. Look here, none of the reports mention that the any relation with the mental illness as well as any relation with the substance abuse. In the Western world, how do you see, at least many of the repeated studies revealed that at least 90% of the suicides have been due to the mental illness. However, in this report, we see none of the suicides are linked with the mental illness as well as the drug abuse. And if we see the potentially harmful characteristics of media reports, it's the same. A very high proportion of reports have been mentioned the identity of the person as well as the identity of the methods. So next, please. Then again, we also our previous 6 paper study was a 6-month, and now we did in a year round. We follow up the same newspapers to see any variations, and we did in the same manner. So how do we see? We see the same picture regarding the potentially helpful characteristics, that is education material to the general people to prevent suicide or to reduce the suicidal behavior among the general people. However, it's nearly same in the potentially harmful characteristics. The high proportion of the reports again mention the name and occupation of the deceased persons, and also the name of the method of the suicide. The few issues varied in among the studies, because that is the suicidal note. It varies, and also with the relation with the mental illness as well as the drug abuse. But here we also seen that the relation with the mental illness and the drug abuse is the bottom line. And in the how do you see in the online news portals more frequently publishing the photos of the person died by suicide. So what do you see in the other countries? We did a comparative review in both in all Southeast Asian countries, in 11 countries of Southeast Asia. So what do we see in Bangladesh? All the reports have nothing to inform regarding the potentially helpful characteristics of suicide and the suicide preventive initiatives. That is, promoting the Papageno effect in Bangladesh is absolutely absent. However, in India, in Bhutan and Sri Lanka, they are much reporting more than the suicide national statistics, suicide prevention identities, and suicide prevention programs, as well as any hotline number. in the reports. In my personal experience, I came across at least 1,000 reports of Bangladesh in suicide reporting. However, I cannot see any report mentions the hotline number of suicide prevention. And how do you see in the other countries, that is Indonesia, it's nearly same as in Bangladesh. And other countries like Malaysia, they are highly following the media reports of suicide. And a few aspects could be drawn here that the journalists have a few difficulties regarding mentioning the suicide statistics might have, because we don't have adequate epidemiological studies to mention frequently. Number one. Number two, the journalists are probably, I believe, they are not oriented and they are not aware regarding the media reporting status and effect of media reporting on suicide prevention. Thirdly, I speculate that they don't have regular liaison with the mental health professions. So that is really challenging to report in suicidal news to promote the Papageno effect and to reduce the further effects. So that is all from my end and my picture. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Yes, anyone, please feel free to share in chat or to ask directly. I would like to start by asking a question. And thank you so much for sharing your work with us. Again, that's been so incredibly helpful to be able to learn from you and these different studies that you've done to get a sense of what the issue of suicide and reporting is looking like in Bangladesh. I'm wondering what ideas you have about who in Bangladesh they could reach out to if they need to consult with experts or to learn more. What would be some good resources, or where could they go for some of that information?
It's a very important initiative that should be started immediately, but there are a few challenges. What I believe there should have, the central agencies should come forward. That is the central news or reporters agency to come up with and to talk with the Bangladesh Psychiatric Association to assign somebody to communicate regularly. Otherwise, there might have chances to produce much chaos, because if individually communicate with the otherwise individual persons who are not assigned to ventilate or disseminate the messages, there might have produced some disequilibrium. So to me, I think the both of the central agency of reporters as well as the central agency of Bangladesh Psychiatric Association or mental health, that is the Bangladesh Psychiatric Association, should come forward to make a enduring liaison between the mental health professional as well as the reporters. Number one. Number two, I believe the reporters as well as the editors should make aware regarding the importance of media reports and suicide. And that shouldn't be all on a sudden and episodic or any surprise. That should be enduring and continuous. But for a temporary basis, what the journalists could do, they can liaise with their local mental health professionals. Yes, they may surround some of the psychiatrists or psychologists or even academicians, those who are working with suicide, researchers or suicidologists, to communicate regarding the reporting characteristics.
Thank you very much for your insight on that. I think that's quite helpful.
One thing I can add, that is besides, I don't think Kanpeteroi is our national suicide prevention hotline. It's basically an NGO, and they are collaborating with the Befrienders of International Association of Suicide Prevention. So my personal experience is there is our national suicide hotline, that is 999, that has been starting, and I have personal experience that our team have saved a person by calling 999. So, the lady attempted suicide, closing her door and closing all his communication, her mobile, and suddenly we call the 999 and to find out his address, and by them they find out her address, and we reach there and broke her door, and we can
Wow.
we able to save her.
Wow.
So 999
That's
is an
wonderful
also
to know.
important, but I feel difficulties regarding the Kanpetro. The service is not 24/7. Number one, number
Right.
two, the helplines are somehow like mobile numbers. So what I suggest and what I believe, the numbers should be unique and very approachable for the general people. So, so there certainly we need a, national helpline, that is only dedicated for the suicides. The Kanpetroi also deal with the distressful people due to the interpersonal violence or interpersonal violence or other issues.
That's really good to know. Thank you so much for sharing that. Do you know if the 999 number is a 24/7
Yes.
number? It
It's
is. Okay. And is that specifically designated for suicide or is there something else? Okay.
No. It's national crisis number. It's
Okay.
not suicide, but what I suggest, or what I feel, we need a similar number, similar hotline for 24/7.
Okay. I see. And who manages the 999 number?
It's the government, Bangladesh government,
Government? Is it
Bangladesh
the
police, Bangladesh
okay.
police.
Police? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So I know another NGO. They are working on that. They are working on that, and they are trying to establish a suicide call center.
Excellent. Excellent. That's fantastic to know. I do hope that everyone is able to write that down as another good resource. It's quite important that that's a 24/7 line because, as you mentioned, that will be really important as something that's more accessible for people. So please do write that down. That's a great opportunity to start incorporating some of that information on helplines and resources and other things that will be great to include in those articles moving forward. Did anyone else have any other questions that you'd like to bring up for Dr. Arafat? Okay. Is there anything else you would like to share as the last word for your segment here?
No, thank you. I must convey my heartiest thanks to Lauren and Ariel for arranging and picking up such an important issue in Bangladesh. It's really an hard-won issue, and we need to accommodate all this issue holistically, because we certainly we also need a national suicide surveillance system. So and to formulate a national suicide prevention strategy, the national suicide surveillance system and hotline is a fundamental issue. So my thanks to Lauren and Ariel, and thanks for inviting me, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much for taking your time to share with us here. We appreciate it deeply, and again are thankful and honored. It's a privilege to be able to work with you, and we're so glad that you were able to share with us today in our training
Thank you.
team. So,
Bye.
Okay. At this point, we are almost done with our first section here, and we would like to do a quick review. I want to mention as well, we have presented in chat, Ariel shared the 999 number. Please do write that down. Again, we're learning as we go along here as well. But please do remember to include that. It's very important that that is a 24/7 available resource. And we are also hearing about another emotional support research from Dust Free Green Bangladesh. So please do make note of that if that will be something useful for you. So to review what we've discussed so far, we're going to take a brief look at some examples of published articles and see some things that were done well and some things that were done poorly. We are going to send you back to menti.com for one more activity at this point. And what we would like you to share here is one thing that you learned or found important from this session. As a quick note, as we are wrapping up this section, we do have, so the second part of this, we will take a short break after we do this quick review activity. The next piece has to do with reporting COVID-19 and the ways that that interacts with suicide risk, which are actually very significant. From our pre-training survey, We found that lots of people had lots of different thoughts about whether or not that was an issue. And so we will go the full time. Just so you know, we will give you a break in just a couple minutes here. We're really thankful for your attention. Ariel will be presenting much of the next section. So you will finally get a break from listening to me, which is excellent. So please do bear with us as you're able to. So to move forward here, and thank you all for the feedback. That's very encouraging. We're thankful that you're here. Thanks for spending the time with us today. So things that people so far have learned or found important are hotlines for emergency, 24/7, and responsible reporting. The ways and importance of sharing information with sensitivity through the media, staying updated on available resources for suicide prevention, supporting suicide survivors and sharing those. Someone said it was interesting to look at the data of suicide reporting and helpful to see the connection, influence that media can have. Lots of things, how to deal with suicide reporting, do's and don'ts, stigma and responsibility, learning what information should be provided, what's the valuable findings of studies about suicide in Bangladesh, person first language, impact of media. Other people have mentioned leaving suicide out of the headline, minimizing details and method without photos, videos, location specific details. Someone else mentioned having an idea of how to present suicide news, which is great, especially those things that cannot be presented. Thank you all so much for sharing that. A couple of things, we're going to go over this again one more time with examples to give you a picture of what this can look like and what the content of a report can do well and do poorly, just to give you some practice in recognizing some of those things that we've talked about, things that you want to, hopefully will start to jump out at you in different ways or be highlighted to you as problems in a report or as good things in a report, things that you can keep in mind in your own practice. So our first example is in this article, headline, physician commits suicide over wife's infidelity. Some things here that we want to think about in terms of unsafe reporting. Already, we have commit suicide in the headline, which we talked about. That increases the prominence or the attention, how that's highlighted, that's a problem. Mentioning wife's infidelity, again, this assumes a single cause, where we know we had that long list of risk factors. There are many things that can interact at a given moment in a person's life that can lead them to the point of thinking about suicide. So summarizing it in a headline is again not the best choice here. You will see in the body of the article, and we've circled where this is the case, there are many specific details given, including the method. So we mentioned he took an insulin overdose, was specified as the method. Also, this can increase the stigma for the family immensely, giving very personal details. And there's also no general information or resources shared. And that's something, as Dr. Arafat mentioned, has not really been seen in suicide reporting in Bangladesh at all. So that's one very simple item that you can easily add to your reports that will be very helpful immediately. So those are a few things to keep in mind. Another example from a different context, this is a celebrity suicide example. More unsafe reporting practices here would be reporting, again, a high profile or famous person, using the word suicide in the headline and giving many very specific details about the way that she died. This was a very, very famous fashion designer. And so this particular death drew a lot of media attention for a long time. However, there are a couple of helpful components here. They did include resources and hotline number for people to seek help and also gave some general statistics and information about the issue of suicide. So that was good. An example of better reporting, again, this is a Western context of a pastor. It does highlight the word suicide in the headline, but it's possible suicide, so it leaves room for correction if that hasn't been confirmed yet. And it does highlight resources and hotline as the priority. You'll mention that before they even start the text of the article. There's a note saying, if you experience suicidal thoughts, here are some resources. You can use this crisis text line. And it also shares that the reason for not giving details about the method, it says, this is currently under investigation. We're following these guidelines for responsible reporting, and so we're choosing not to share details. So they tell the reader why they're not giving them more information. And so that's all helping to create more awareness. And again, the mention of suicide in the headline is probably not the best option, but this is a better approach to reporting and one that you can use in your own practices as well. At this point, let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break. The next piece here, we have a little under an hour left. So again, please do stick with us. This is another very important piece. We'll go quite quickly through some of this. Much of the information is related to what we just talked about. And again, you've all been really wonderful. We're so thankful that you're here and for all of the great thoughts that you've shared with us so far. There are some specific ways that this has come up during COVID-19, and we do want to take the chance to discuss all of that with you as well. So go ahead and take 5 minutes here. We'll come back at 15 after and look forward to talking with you more then. Thank you again, and look forward to getting started.
Okay, everyone, thank you so much for sticking with us and welcome back. I hope the break was helpful for you. We know that it's been a lot of information and we appreciate so much your attention and your participation today. And so the second piece of the training is going to focus on COVID-19 reporting specifically. And we're going to talk about COVID-19 and suicide risk and how should updates be reported. And then we're going to end with touching on self-care and how we take care of our own mental health. Okay, so we're going to do another activity. As you can imagine, we will ask you to go to, after this, but as we remind you, this is a really great opportunity to make a checklist, like Lauren mentioned at the beginning, to add items to your checklist as we go through the presentation and look for this signal or this signal to help you draw your attention to things that are important and that we think you might want to take with you for after this training to remember, especially remember in your work and to apply to the roles that you have. And you can use it as a personal research in the future, or personal resource in the future to review anything that you find the most helpful and take it to apply to your own reports. Okay. Do we have any questions so far? Maybe not. And thank you for the welcome. And yes, just a reminder, I'm Ariel and I'm happy to answer any questions. I've been doing the tech so far, so I'm glad to be talking to you. Okay, so how to report on COVID-19, specifically focused on the skills that we've learned thus far and the great information that we've received thus far and how we can use that to reduce suicide risk related to COVID-19. Okay, so I'm going to send you again to menti.com. And if you can go to menti.com and type in this number below and answer the question, what comes to mind when you think about COVID-19? Okay, let's get this up here. And we'll take a couple minutes to see what everybody's responses are, and then we'll discuss. So once again, if you can go to menti.com and type in the code and then answer the question, what comes to mind when you think about COVID-19? We know this has been a really huge topic in the past couple of months, and we've seen it reported. So we'll have a great opportunity to share some of those thoughts that come to our mind and then reflect. Okay, so I am going to, for the sake of time, bring up some of these responses and we can continue to discuss them as they come in. That's great. So somebody in the chat mentioned also livelihood problems, especially for poor people, and livelihood problems for everyone, I would say. Sleep disturbance, uncertainty, lockdown loneliness, depression, anxiety, scary, that's a great word. quarantine, stigma, wearing a mask, lack of control, don't go outside, isolation, anxiety, and jobless. And these are great descriptions, and the fact that they're very intense, and they're definitely communicating to us the level of mental health needs, as well as the fear and the anxiety. And it's important for us to understand, if this is the way that we're feeling, we can also manage how, or imagine the way the rest of the community and the population that are reading our reports is feeling. So they're definitely feeling a lot of uncertainty, a lot of loneliness, anxiety, and the way that we report things and the way that things are said and the way that you all communicate things has an impact on these feelings of joblessness and anxiety and uncertainty. So let's discuss this a little bit further. Okay, so in March 2020, we had the first reported COVID-19 suicide in Bangladesh. And of course, this is the first one that we found. So if you have any other examples that maybe was before March, please let us know. But a Bangladeshi man committed suicide, killed himself in his village because he believed that he had COVID-19. So he had common symptoms that at the time were promoted and are still promoted in some reports as fever, cold, and weight loss. And he, after believing that he had after having these symptoms, he killed himself because he thought he had COVID. However, after getting an autopsy, it was found that he did not end up having COVID-19. So he thought that he did, but he did not. And so some key issues that we see with this, this report and this incident is that there was a huge fear of infection. There was a very intense fear of infection. There was a lot of social avoidance, attitudes, prejudice by others in his village. There was a huge amount of community stigma, which we've been talking about, that influenced and applied pressure. And we suspect that there was a sense of moral duty. So there was a sense of moral duty to ensure that he did not pass the virus on to anyone else in his village or in his community. And it's important to recognize this was very early on, so the amount of information that we had was still very low. And so these are some of the ways that you all, through your reporting, can influence how suicides happen after COVID-19 or not with your reporting. So knowledge about COVID-19 symptoms and how to seek treatment. It's really important that these are up to date and reliable. So we want to give people the guidance and the information to have control. We mentioned in the last activity a loss of control. So you want people to know that they have options when they're looking for treatment and support. The way that we communicate perceptions about people who are ill, thoughts, feelings, and beliefs of the community, and what is necessary to keep themselves safe. So we've discussed how media really impacts the general culture and the general view of many people, influences the conversations that we have in our families. And so it is the responsibility or a tool that we have to positively frame and focus on survivors and positively frame what we're writing about. And then beliefs about transmission and mortality. So we want to be really clear about how fatal or how many people die from this virus. We certainly don't want to minimize the virus. We know it's a very important and dangerous, but we also know that many, many people throughout the world recover, and they recover well, and they recover strong. And so we want to focus on that hope piece, which we've been discussing throughout the entire presentation, and be factual about the amount of people that die from COVID-19. So the next piece that we're going to talk about is the impact of words and the impact of language. I would say that journalists are the best people to discuss language and words with. You all use words in your work every day, and you're always usually very good with words. And so we know that language has a huge impact on the way we feel, and the way that we think about a topic. Language can spread stereotypes. So when we're talking about coronavirus, certain words like a suspect makes us think of something criminal, something negative. And it may, for people, increase stigmatizing attitudes because it communicates that something's wrong or we have something to fear. It can cause misunderstanding and create rumors. And we want to make sure that, or we want to make note that really technical language can cause a lot of confusion. And when people are confused, they become more afraid. And so that can feed assumptions about the disease that could be incorrect and could create harmful rumors, leading to an increase in stigma. It can strengthen false connections between the disease and other factors. So what we're saying here is it links a cause of death, or it links a contraction of the disease with something that is unrelated because of some of those rumors. And it can confuse people, which is a big part of it. It generates fear, and it can dehumanize people who are sick. So we're going to continue to talk through the section about person-first language, and we want to make sure that we're putting a human face and making sure that we're respecting dignity in the way that we're communicating. It can make people resist screening, testing, and quarantine. I think we've all seen examples of this when we're afraid, we're unsure, we're confused, or we don't have up-to-date information. Many of us, our first response is just not to do anything or to be skeptical of the resources that are there. And so that's why it's important that we provide truthful and up-to-date information. And so we know that media shapes how popular language and communication is formed, and it creates the ideas that change how people act. And so words used in the media can really have a strong impact on COVID-19. Poor reporting may influence how people at risk, patients, families, and affected communities are perceived and how they're treated. But we also know that there are really good concrete examples about how media can positively use inclusive language to positively impact the response to different diseases. So HIV, TB, H1N1, and Ebola are all good examples of how the media has contributed to control over different epidemics and pandemics. Okay, moving along, and I hope I'm not going too quickly. We do have quite a bit of information to get through in this section, but please raise your hand or ask any questions if I'm going too fast. Okay, so COVID-19 information, we want to promote basic infection prevention. And again, we want this to come from a credible resource, and we want it to be up to date. Share the symptoms of COVID-19. And as we continue to learn about COVID-19, we continue to find out new symptoms and new symptoms that are more linked to higher prevalence or higher likelihood that a person has COVID. Share accurate lethality information. So sharing accurate death information. Again, we know that COVID-19 is very serious, but we also know that many people, most people, actually, they recover very well and they recover strong. And so we want to make sure that we focus on that as well. And we want to inform when and how to seek healthcare. So again, we know that the more people have the tools and the information that they need to take care of themselves, the less confused and afraid they will be, and the more likely they will be to find treatment options. We want to use simple language and helpline numbers. So clinic locations in your area and places that people can just get general information. And here's a great example of a good way to portray this. So here we have key symptoms at the top, tells us what we need to be looking for. It tells us what to do. And it gives us specific instructions on how to seek care. Not only does it give us specific instructions, but it tells us where to go in a couple different locations. So here we have Cox's Bazar, we have Ukiah, and we have TechNaf. So no matter where you are, this is giving you a specific resource to go to get information and support. And then it's telling you the location of the testing centers, again, in 3 different areas that relate to the specific geography or the specific region. And the other thing to add is that this example gives you an example of or a description of what to expect. So it tells you after calling the hotline, if it is determined that you need a COVID-19 test, you will be referred to one of these places. So it's giving you a roadmap of what to do so that, again, we're reducing the confusion and the misinformation and making people less afraid of what happens when they have symptoms or when they have a potential case. The other thing that we want to point out in this example, even though it does a lot of really good things, is it does lead by saying suspected cases, which we know can be negative, and it can also, like we mentioned earlier, it can correlate something negative or something criminal to the rest of the process and to COVID-19. So those are also things to keep an eye out. Okay, other things that we can do is we can focus on recovery. As I've said multiple times, many people recover and they recover well. And so we want to publish stories and pictures of people who have recovered from COVID-19, people who have been examples of hope. We want to show honor to the doctors, nurses, and other frontline staff that are supporting and helping to take care of people who may have COVID or may think that they have COVID. And we want to be aware of rumors and correct them. And all of this is to address misinformation and to reduce stigma, not only for the people who might have COVID, but also for the people who work and support others who may have COVID or who think that they have similar symptoms. So those are the doctors and nurses and other support staff that are either in the hospitals or the clinics. I'm going to pause there because I do know I've been going a bit quick, and make sure that we don't. Yeah, these are really great points. Omar, you're making some really great points. Oh, and just one thing to add, we want to challenge myths and stereotypes. So we want to be very clear in our reporting. And I just would add that it's also okay to correct a report. It builds trust and credibility. If you publish something or you write something that you found later to not be correct, it's really important to take that responsibility and to publish a correction, because it helps people build trust in the information that you're providing. And it also gives people that accurate information, which is the most important tool. So things that we want to avoid. We want to avoid reporting on specific person's responsibility for spreading COVID-19. This will increase stigma of people who are sick. And we want to avoid speculating about the source of COVID-19 in Bangladesh or in any particular city or region. We don't want to make a one person or one group of people or one area a target, or we don't want to cause any blame or stigma in that way. And it is recommended that we avoid avoid focusing on efforts to find treatment. And this may seem a little counterintuitive because treatment will be a really great relief for this situation. But because we know that it's going to take a while, and because we know we will throughout the process have many positives and negatives, this can make people feel helpless that they can do anything in the immediate moment. And again, we want them to use this information to take action to protect themselves and to protect those around them. Okay, things that we do want to do when we're focusing on word choice. And so the rest of these slides are really going to focus on word choice, and I encourage you to think about how you can use these in your own writing, and also remember those considerations of person first language. And also think about what is the impact. So I'll ask for some feedback throughout the next section, but think about what is the impact of the different word choices that we're going to talk about. Do talk about coronavirus. So that goes without saying, but what we're talking about here is that we want to specifically call it by its name. So the new coronavirus or COVID-19. We do not want to attach any locations or ethnicities to the disease. So we don't want it to refer to it as the Wuhan virus, the Chinese virus, or the foreign virus. And can anybody quickly mention what you think the impact is if you do use some of the language like Chinese virus or Wuhan virus? What would be the impact of reporting it in that way? Take a second. And if you want to unmute yourself to share, please feel free. Okay, we're going to keep going, but keep thinking about those impacts and thinking about the impact of the word choice. And if you think of something, don't hesitate to share. Okay, do talk about people who may have COVID-19. So we do not want to talk about COVID-19 suspects or suspected cases or victims. Again, this is a negative connotation. It makes us think about that there's something to be afraid, something that is dangerous about this, which we know we need to be careful, but the person themselves is not the danger. And so here we have an example. People who have been infected and focusing on the recovery rate. And here, a more negative, we're talking about a more negative example that Bangladesh confirms the first death from new coronavirus. Okay. So before we move on, I just want to touch one more time on the idea, going back here, of person first language. So as we mentioned, and we are of course open to any reflections on this if this doesn't work as well in Bangla or any other language that you might speak, we want to focus on the dignity of the person and separate the person from the disease. Because again, we know that many people will recover, and so they will be more than just the disease, and we don't want to link them in a way that makes them seem like something negative or to demonize them. So we do want to talk about people acquiring or contracting COVID-19. We do not want to talk about people transmitting, infecting, or spreading the virus. One more question. What do you think the impact would be of writing or reporting on people transmitting, infecting, or spreading the virus? What could be a possible impact of using those words in a report? And that might just be helpful for you to think about or to write down on your checklist as well. Because when we're hearing these things, it implies intention and it implies blame. So it makes it seem like the person is doing it on purpose, or that they are, that we need to blame them for the spread of the virus, which we know could be very dangerous for increasing stigma. Okay, do speak accurately about risk based on science and health advice. So we've been talking throughout this, and I've mentioned a couple times, we want to have good, up-to-date and reliable sources that we're getting our information from, that we're reporting. And we don't want to repeat or share rumors or use sensational language like the plague or the apocalypse, because we know that this will cause panic, and we want to avoid causing panic. Okay, do talk positively and emphasize the effectiveness of prevention and treatment. So we've mentioned sharing resources, sharing information about up-to-date resources and information about prevention. What is the most recommended thing to do to keep yourself safe? And so we want to emphasize that this is effective in this moment. And we don't want to focus on the negative messages or the threat. Like you all mentioned in that word cloud that we did a few minutes ago, there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of anxiousness, a lot of worry. And so we already know that people are very focused on the negative. And so we want to balance that and counter that with some truthful and positive messages about the effectiveness. So advice. Sandra wants to reassure people who notice their symptoms, compared to a country that reports 14 cases of the deadly infection. So when we contrast these together, we see that one is giving advice, it's promoting hope, reassuring people that they have control over some of these symptoms in the situation, whereas the other one is a bit more fearful. It makes you feel more fearful. Okay. So the last thing that we'll talk about here is we do want to make sure that we highlight the effectiveness of prevention, of protective measures like we talked about earlier, early screening, testing, and treatment. So we want to focus on what are the prevention measures that people can take in their everyday life. How can they control this situation? What are the protective measures? What are the things that are going to keep you safe that you may already be doing in your life as a reinforcement? We want to focus on early screening, and that's why it's so important to provide those resources and the accurate information about where to go and who to call to get testing or early screening. And then testing. Encourage people to get tested. And again, people will go if you give them the correct information and if they feel like it's easy enough to do. and then treatment. And so we want to focus on all of these aspects in our writing because we know collectively from reliable sources like the WHO that when we combine all these together, they will increase people's confidence, they will increase adherence to prevention measures, but they will also reduce some of that anxiety because we know a lot of the reasons that people are may commit suicide after thinking that they have COVID is related to, misinformation and stigma. Okay, do we have any questions? Again, I'm sorry, I know that was quite quick. And so please let me know if there's anything that I didn't get to. Mm-hmm. And so this is a good story or a good example given in the chat that I will share. So a friend that has been hospitalized with COVID-19 and other family members and villagers believe that they aren't treated fairly and equally, so they have not trusted media sources to raise their feelings. This is a really good example of why it's important to be consistent, to use reliable resources. One thing that Lauren mentioned earlier was getting consent from the community when we're publishing things. Not only does that respect their dignity and their privacy, but it builds trust and relationships between the community and the people. So people know that if you're a reporter that is always concerned about the family and their feelings and their privacy, then they can trust you to report on some of these issues and to tell you truthfully their experiences. And so that's one suggestion that I have, but I would love to open it up to others who have any other ideas of what could be done from your perspective and your experiences. Okay, so I think for the sake of time, we'll keep moving forward on to our next steps. But thank you again so much. I'm glad that I got to talk to you today, and let us know if you have anything you want to follow up. And again, I'm very sorry that we had to go a bit quick, but we'll send out the slides on the back end and you can review anything that you couldn't catch on the first round. So thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ariel, for sharing about that. And we're certainly going to invite you to continue reflecting on that. Again, add in chat any further questions or thoughts that you have regarding COVID-19 specifically. And again, just being aware of the impact that this pandemic has on people's mental health, on their state of minds, what they believe about what is coming for them. And as Omar also mentioned in the chat, the ways that that can interact with other things that might actually be more urgent for some groups of people than others is just one more factor that can really make people come to a bad place. And those are all really important things to be aware of, to be thinking about, things to consider as you're choosing your stories and as you're framing them. All of these are good to keep in mind. And notice, we have one more question here. When we have this kind of bad reporting, what should we do in terms of mental health? Good question. We're about to speak to that quickly here. So I'll keep moving forward and we will discuss this because this is also very important. And we may have some opportunity to do a bit more work along those lines in the future as well. But we will, to finish, this is one of the last things we wanted to leave you with. So next steps, we want to take some time here to think about how to bring all of this together and what you can do to follow up on some of the things that we've talked about today. So the first thing that we want to mention is just thinking about the reporting style and the language that you currently use. Think about this when you're reporting about a suicide, and think about this when you report about a crisis like COVID-19, some of these other crises that people could be experiencing in addition or even more urgently than COVID-19 that can also increase their risk for suicide. When all of those things come together, it can be kind of an overwhelming burden. Also, help to educate other media professionals. One of the reasons why we're holding this workshop as a mixed group with mental health professionals and media professionals is because we would really like for teams to partner moving forward, to be able to present this hopefully in Bangla or in different languages, to be able to share this with more people. We know that there's not always consistent access to training or learning about suicide reporting. Depending on your training program or your background or experience, I know we had some people who were students here as well. We want to get these resources available to more people. And so we're hoping to, this can be done in different ways, through classroom teaching, through workshops like this. And in the follow-up to this, we'll send you another survey. Thank you for your patience in completing these. This is really helpful to us. We will ask you some more questions about ways you might be interested in working together with each other or with us to follow up on this, and help to connect with others in the journalist and media community. And like Dr. Arafat mentioned earlier, helping to take some steps toward bringing the mental health communities and the media communities in Bangladesh together. Ultimately, that's something that you all will have to do. That's not something that I can do, but we would love to help to make those connections as we can in the scope of the work that we're doing here. Another option, a next step would be to create a professional self-monitoring system. This can work in several different ways, either within certain media outlets. These are just ideas. Being able to, again, do some more of those trainings with the reporters, the journalists, the professionals on your teams, being able to watch, to monitor any reports of suicide that are not presenting it in a helpful way or immediately highlighting sort of improper reporting practices to producers or editors, basically making sure that the people who have the opportunity to share these stories really have the information and the support that they need to do that well. Furthermore, we would really recommend and hope that you all will also advocate for including more information about suicide reporting in professional training curriculum. It's recommended that training courses for journalists and media professionals cover this material. And feel free to comment. We would be really interested to hear, for those of you present, if you were trained as a media professional or a journalist. Was the topic of suicide reporting ever covered during your training? What do you think should be done differently in training programs? Again, if you don't mention now, this is feedback that we would love to hear from you through the survey that we'll send out afterwards. We would love to have more discussions to understand what your training background has been and whether any of this would be useful for the communities that you are a part of. So out of all of these steps, consider what is possible to begin doing tomorrow, next year, 5 years from now. But remember that there are some changes that are possible right away. And hopefully you'll have been able to collect some of those through the checklist items. We will also send out some basic guidelines and other resources in the next couple of days to follow up from this training. Those will be sent to the same email address that you used to register. So look for those, and we hope that those will be helpful resources. Also, feel free to follow up with us. If there's something you're interested in learning more about, we might not know, but we can help you look for resources or more information, and are also open to hearing from you about what other information might be helpful, or what other kinds of workshops would be useful for you moving forward. So our last activity, I promise, has to do with looking after your teams and yourself. So our last visit to menti.com will be to answer the question, how can you stay healthy while reporting on the topic of suicide? Or like one of our participants mentioned, if you're reporting on heavy, difficult topics in general, that is important. I'm sure you all have felt that. much more intensely than even we can imagine. We have some ideas, we have some suggestions for you, but we'd like to hear what the group has to think and has to say about this first. So if you could just quickly take a moment and give it some thought. Think about what are some ways that you might be able to stay healthy as you're encountering these very dark or difficult things. So we have very few ideas here. Couple of ideas. Thoughts so far that people had to share were to be aware of yourself by verifying the information. So I think probably talking about being aware and paying attention to your own experience, pay attention to how you feel. Someone else mentioned focusing on self-care activities, connecting with family and friends and well-wishers. That's great. That's connection with other people who care for you, love you, support you, is one of the best things you can do. Someone else mentioned identify how you react and cope. Any of the coping, if any of the coping methods are harmful to you mentally or physically, you should reach out to shift these to positive. Reaching to professional help if your symptoms increased. That's great too. And being aware of your own tendency. What are the things that you turn to for comfort or for coping when you're not feeling well? If those are more harmful for you, then thinking about what are some other things you can do instead. Those are all really great ideas. And this is difficult. All of this is difficult because at the end of the day, there's nothing that you can do that can make this go away. There's nothing that you can do that will remove the pain or the grief or the loss that you might have experienced or that you might see other people experiencing. And that's really important to acknowledge. And that's not what this is about. That's not what we're trying to do. Omar mentioned in chat to believe in ourselves, to keep confidence and patience when reporting about suicide. That's a great point as well. Thank you for that. And focusing on those things that you can do and the ways that you can respond. We had a few ideas to share as well. Again, remembering that reporting suicide can be distressing, especially if you've been affected by suicide yourself in any way. Journalists can also report, and many of you work in places where there can be graphic evidence of a death. You may see or be affected by other people's distress or pain, or you may need to talk with people or interview them if they are if they're grieving or in shock. And it's important that you safeguard your own well-being in those situations too. If you're a journalist, consider alerting your manager if you believe you'll be negatively affected by covering a story. And during and following a story, again, coming back to being aware of your own emotional reactions and consider discussing it with someone that you trust. Professional support through psychologist or a counselor can be an option, and also just the people around you who are your trusted family, your friends, the people that you have great confidence in, who can help you, who know you well too. Your role in shaping public opinion during difficult times is very important. And so our suggestions about how to engage in this work while caring for your colleagues and yourself are writing about hope. So having lists of resources, guidance on how to find help, and sharing stories or messages of hope are really important parts of any coverage like this. Being thoughtful in assignments, assign teams to cover different areas of disasters and tragedies, so no one person is overwhelmed. Make sure that reporters who connect with grieving survivors or people who have suffered terribly are sensitive people who are good at interviewing. Also making counseling, sharing reminders that caring for yourself is important. Giving people permission, people on your teams, if they need to take a break, tell them they are allowed to take a break, because they won't if you don't tell them that they can. Making counseling available if possible in different ways is also important. If journalists have been directly affected by a difficult situation or a disaster, make sure their assignments are covered, provide the support they need to address the situation, care for them, ask what they need, listen well, and respond to that. Let them know that they are not alone and that their agency and community will support them. Also, rest. Cannot emphasize this enough. Take frequent breaks from working on difficult assignments and prioritize rest, whatever that needs to look like, on a regular basis, at least one full day a week, if this is part of your regular routine of work and responsibility. Staying healthy as much as possible, making sure your body is able to move, eat well as much as possible, try to prioritize sleep and rest. Keeping as consistent a schedule as you can manage helps. So not staying up all night one day and then going to bed very early the next, but trying to keep a similar structure to your days can help with that. And finally, reaching out, talking to a person that you trust about how you feel. It could be an editor, colleague, family member, but it's very important to trust that that person will not judge you for what you say. Perhaps it is someone who faced a similar experience. I want to highlight what Omar has also mentioned in chat. He feels strong and more confident when he can focus on thinking that he is helping people who might be feeling helpless. And so being able, and that's really what I want to finish on, is this idea of caring for ourselves is also caring for each other, and that you as part of a community have the opportunity to care for your team, to care for the people around you. And like Omar had mentioned so beautifully, the act of reaching out to care for someone else can actually be an act of care for yourself that can help to strengthen you, that can help to give you confidence in addition to some of these other things. And so to finally finish here, we want to share a few more reminders. Accurate content and what you report is important, but it is not enough on its own. What also matters is what you say, the way you practice your profession, and how you tell these stories about life and death. Your relationships with each other as a professional community, how you help by teaching and training and holding one another to a high standard. So ultimately, all that you create and send out into the world is actively shaping the culture around you. And this is true whether you are thinking about this and aware of it or not. That's what you do. It's part of your role, and it's your role within your society, within your culture. You can reach them in ways that no one else can. So we invite you to help create a culture that gives people a vision to live. Do we have any final questions before we finish for today? Wonderful. Again, we will be available. We're happy to follow up with you by email. You can just respond to the registration emails that you've received here. Thank you so much for your participation. It has been a joy and a privilege to get to share with you. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, your ideas. You should have received emails. That's how you got here, unless we sent you a link directly. So you can reach out to me, to Ariel as well.
Thank you so much.
Complete the post test.
Yes.
We have the link here on the next slide. Again, these will ask a lot of the same questions as the pre-test, but this will also give us your feedback. We asked a couple more questions about things you would be interested in, other ways that you want to follow up on this information that we talked about today moving forward. Please fill that out. If you want to receive a certificate for participating in this training, we do need to receive that. As soon as we get your registration back, we will be able to send that out to you. And we'll send this out in an email in the next couple of days as well. So you should have that.
And if we wait just a second, I will grab this link and I will pop it into the chat.
Oh, perfect.
So that it's a bit easier, and then I also put our emails directly in there. So like Laura mentioned, please feel free to reach out to us and follow up with any questions or suggestions, anything that you learned that you want to learn more about. And here's the link right there.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ariel. Again, we wish we could do this in person. We wish we had time now to just chat and spend with you all. But again, thank you so much for being with us for so much of your day today. We are, again, honored and thankful to get to spend that time with you and look forward to hopefully staying in touch. So thank you so much for your participation, for sharing, and stay well.
Thank you all so much. Stay safe. Such great participation and suggestions. So we've learned a lot as well, which we really appreciate. So thank you.